Hello and welcome to Canguro English. I'm Christian, and today we are going to talk about whether you should learn British English or American English. Now, over the years, lots of students have asked me whether they should learn British or American English. And any good teacher will tell you that there is no best English, really. But I want to dig a little deeper into this question and ask some bigger questions. Like, for example, how many varieties of English are there? And can all of the different varieties of English understand each other? And finally, how can I understand and be understood by other English speakers? So a lot of people think that English is a language, and there are two main varieties. There is British English and American English. But is that true? Well, I think first we need to define exactly what a language is. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a language is a system of communication used by a particular country or community. But that is a pretty broad definition. So, for example, how do we define a community? And how do we define a system of communication? So, for example, if me and 10 of my friends, we decide to start a new speaking in a particular way, would this be considered a new language? Are we a community? And what if we didn't use words? What if we just wrote down notes and passed them to each other using our strange new words? Would that be considered a language? Would that be considered a system of communication? Or what if we didn't speak or write down words? What if we just used body language? Would that be considered a system of communication? So what about linguists? How do they define a language? According to Ethnologue, scholars recognize that languages are not always easily or best treated as discrete, identifiable and countable units with clearly defined boundaries between them. Rather, a language is more often comprised of a continuum of features that extends across time, geography, and social space. So actually, I think that's a pretty good definition of what a language is. But sometimes what is considered a language is also decided by the speakers. And that can be decided for social or political reasons. For example, in China, Cantonese and Mandarin are considered by the Chinese government dialects of the Chinese language. But actually they are not mutually intelligible, meaning that speakers of Cantonese and Mandarin cannot understand each other and they cannot communicate. And on the other hand, Serbian and Croatian are actually the same language. They have an identical grammar, but due to the painful breakup of the Yugoslavia, the Serbs and the Croats consider their languages to be completely distinct languages, when really they're exactly the same. And then within languages, we have what are called dialects, which are actually even more difficult to define. For example, within the UK, there are a lot of official dialects. For example, Belfast, Birmingham, Bolton, Lancashire, Central Cumberland, Cockney, Cornwall, Craven, Yorkshire, Cumberland, Devonshire, Dorset, Durham, East Anglia, East Devonshire, Edinburgh, Geordie, Glaswegian, Lowland Scottish, Newcastle, Northumberland, Norfolk, etc., etc. So now let's imagine that we have defined a language, and then we have defined a variety or a dialect within that language. But it doesn't stop there, because also there are a number of factors that can affect how we use a language in a specific situation. So the factors include the age of the speaker, the social status of the speaker, the topic, what you're speaking about, and also the environment, the setting. So for example, you probably talk to your grandmother differently to how you talk to your best friend. And maybe when you're talking about religion or politics, maybe use different language than if you were talking about films or books. And there is one other factor that affects languages probably more profoundly than anything else, and that is, of course, time. For example, we could say that Chaucer in the 1400s was writing and using English, but if he were alive today, it would be probably impossible to communicate with him. So how many different varieties of English are there? Well, as we can see, there are no real criteria to define exactly what a variety of English is, or of any language. But let's start by looking at the number of countries in the world that speak English and their populations. So there are 6 countries in the world where English is the de facto native language, and that is the United States, with 231 million native speakers, the United Kingdom with 60 million, Canada with 19 million, Australia with at least 17 million, Ireland with 4.2 million, and New Zealand with 3.7 million. So they are countries where English is the de facto native language. But are there any other countries which speak English as an official language? Yes, there are lots, and they represent millions and millions and millions of English speakers. For example, in Ghana we have 23.5 million people who use English as a primary language. In India we have 1.25 billion people who use English as a primary language, especially in education settings. In Nigeria, we have 218 million people who use English as a primary language. Kenya, 37.5 million people who use English as a primary language. Pakistan, 165 million people. The Philippines, 100 million people. Singapore, 5.5 million people. Rwanda, nearly 10 million people. South Africa, nearly 53 million people, and Tanzania, 40 million people, and Uganda, 30 million people. So what does this mean? This means, for example, that in Nigeria, there are 3 times as many people using English as a primary language than there are in the United Kingdom. That is incredible. And it also means, if we total up all of the countries, that 80% of the non-native but reasonably competent English speakers live outside of the native-speaking countries. And it also means that a majority of these people will never actually communicate in English with a native speaker. So it means that we really have to change the way that we view competency between native and non-native speakers. So now we can see that there is a huge variety of English being spoken in a huge number of countries by an incredibly large number of people. And the next important question is, can all of these people understand each other? Well, some factors, the most important factors that decide whether people can understand each other would be cultural contact and geographical distance. Geographical distance creates something called the Dialect Continuum, and Stephen R. Anderson from the Linguistic Society of America, I think he describes it best. Suppose you were to start from Berlin and walk to Amsterdam, covering about 10 miles every day. You can be sure that the people who provided your breakfast each morning could understand the people who served you dinner that evening. Nonetheless, the German speakers at the beginning of your trip and the Dutch speakers at the end of your trip would have a lot of trouble, and they would think of themselves as speaking 2 quite distinct languages. So this explains the geographical factors, but also exposure to culture is really important. And that's why there are so many anecdotes about American tourists going to Scotland or going into London and not having any idea about what the local people are saying, because the culture travels in the other direction in general. So British people and Scottish people are exposed to a lot of American films, television series, and so they have much less difficulty understanding Americans than Americans have understanding Scottish people. So what about some more hard data? Well, in 1979, Larry E. Smith and Khalilullah Rafiqzad designed a study involving 1,386 people in 11 countries. They wanted to find out if all of the native and non-native speakers in these different countries could understand each other. And the results were really surprising. They discovered that out of all of the varieties of English being tested, that the native American speaker was the least intelligible out of all of the different varieties of English tested. In fact, the American native speaker could only be understood 55% of the time. Now, let's compare this to a study in 1989 by John B. Jensen, who did a study to see if Portuguese and Spanish were mutually intelligible. And his results discovered that Portuguese speakers and Spanish speakers could understand each other about 50 to 60% of the time. Now, if we compare this to the results from the previous study, this means that the American native speaker could be understood about as much as a Portuguese or Spanish person. So, does that mean that we could consider that Chinese English and American English are two completely separate languages, like Portuguese and Spanish? But I think for me, the most important finding from this study was that a speaker who was highly intelligible in one country was also highly intelligible in all of the other countries. So, for example, since native speaker phonology doesn't appear to be more intelligible than non-native phonology, there seems to be no reason to insist that the performance target in the English classroom be a native speaker. A person speaking any variety of educated English, although phonologically non-native, can expect to be intelligible to his listeners. So basically, it doesn't matter whether you're native or non-native. If you speak well, then you'll be understood pretty much everywhere and by everybody. So to answer the original question, should you learn British English or American English? Well, the answer is that because the grammar is functionally identical in all of the varieties of English, what you need to do is learn the foundations of English without prejudice, and then learn to put on top of that the pronunciation and vocabulary and other dialect attributes of the place that you are going to be. A good approach in the classroom would be to follow the guide proposed by Wafa Shahada Zogbor from the University of Leicester, who created a core pronunciation guide which identifies all of the important sounds in English that can affect your intelligibility. So basically, if you follow his guide, then even though your English is accented, it should be understood pretty much everywhere. So if you're asking yourself, can I be understood and can I understand other varieties of English? Well, unfortunately, that question is impossible to answer because it depends on the person you are speaking with or communicating with in that particular moment. I think that Larry Smith of the International Association for World Englishes says, "Our English only needs to be intelligible to those with whom we wish to communicate in English." I think in general that it's really unfortunate that some non-native speakers feel inferior to native speakers. But to talk like a native speaker shouldn't really be your goal. Your goal should be to focus on a successful communication outcome. It could be as simple as, do you want to buy a hamburger? Did you get the hamburger? Or it could be as complex as negotiating an international trade deal. But your focus should never be on comparison with native English speakers. And as English grows as a global and international language, it will have to become more flexible and more tolerant of the different varieties and the errors that occur all over the world. If you would like to see any more videos about grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, anything else, then don't forget to subscribe to Canguro English. Thank you very much. I'll see you in class.